All right, so I was sick this weekend and decided to do something that I haven't done in at least 15 years, which is watch the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, 9.5 hours worth of quality entertainment. And I was pretty surprised by what I saw. I think Lord of the Rings is something that is so well known and synonymous with popular culture and fantasy that if you haven't watched it for a while, you just remember like Gandalf and maybe have that memory that Gandalf is just like Dumbledore, and then Aragorn and Legolas, and then the Hobbits sort of been, I don't know, almost like meme worthy characters. But it was interesting to go back and look and see actually what the movies were about, and it wasn't really what I was expecting. And I think given the last 20 years worth of films since these have come out, and especially the last 10, these fantasy and you can throw superhero movies into that same bucket. They've just become notoriously worse and worse. And before I went back and looked at these ones, it was hard to know why, or maybe you almost put Lord of the Rings in that same bucket. Like maybe it's a bit lame because it's a fantasy series. But what I found was that these movies were, if anything, very inspirational. They were like basically like Rocky, but less sport related, but in terms of real life and overcoming struggle, which I think was the key part of the movies, they really almost bring you to tears at certain times, like with the amount of struggle they put their characters in and how they have to come up against the odds and fight back. And another point is that a lot of movies these days are moving to this very morally grey, or like the grayness of characters, like the ability for evil to exist within good. And it's interesting to watch these films because they explore that to the nth degree, but the message isn't that characters are complex and we need to be okay with that. Like say like a Tony Soprano, for example, how he's mostly bad, but then he's good, and it's like, oh, he's morally grey. Like Lord of the Rings, with things like the ring, and power, there's a lot of messages in there that absolute power corrupts absolutely, but the message is not, well, we just, no matter what happens, things are going to be bad. It's the odds are against you, but there is um, good in this world worth fighting for. And even though the ring will corrupt anyone, like Gandalf, he does not want to touch the ring because he knows with his power it will wield a lot of evil onto the world. But his approach is not then to give up and just become evil like Saruman does. He says, no, like we're still going to find a way to succeed. And yeah, eventually they do succeed at the end of the third movie. But for the 9 hours before the success comes, it's just struggle and obstacle, and all of their factions have moved apart and they need to bring them back together. And I think it's just a great story of when things go bad, how you can be a leader and bring people back together, show them the way, and come through bad times, which is something that's very relevant today. It seems like the world is getting worse and worse, and a lot of the messaging is just give up. Like there's no hope. But watching these movies, it was very refreshing because it was like, no, like the odds will be a million times against you, but you fight and fight and fight till the end. And no matter what happens, you keep going. So I thought it was really good, and I've got a few takeaways. So first of all, this idea of the reluctant hero. A lot of movies, it feels like the hero, he wants to do it, but in Lord of the Rings, a lot of the heroes do not really want to be there. Even Aragorn, who ends up being the king, he begins as Strider, this outcast a lone rider guy, and he has to almost be convinced into taking his role as the king, which he earns by the end of the third film. But I think in particular the hobbits are a great example of this, and yeah, they are needed because they are perhaps less powerful than a Gandalf who doesn't want to wield the ring, or like a Boromir who even being in the vicinity of the ring makes him want to take it and wield the evil power. But the hobbits are needed because they are more pure of heart and less powerful, and so Gandalf is like, okay, we're gonna use Frodo and his well, he wants to use Frodo, and then he uses Sam because he was eavesdropping. But then Merry and Pippin get involved, and they have their own journeys as reluctant heroes as well. So Frodo, I guess, being the main hero of the story, he fits this perfectly, and his journey of being this happy-go-lucky young hobbit to going through absolute hell, and then by the end of Return of the King, having to leave the Shire because he feel like he can't go back. It's pretty amazing, and he cops a lot of flack, I think, as a character, like that he doesn't do his job properly, or Sam is the real hero of the story. But Frodo never asks to be the hero, and there's a good quote from Gandalf which I'll share in a minute. But Frodo basically says, I don't really want this, and Gandalf says, well, that's not your decision. You have to do it. And for the most part, Frodo does a great job. We haven't seen any of the other characters hold on to the ring, throughout the year that they're on the journey, like Frodo does. But he does it, and he loses himself over the journey. And then when he gets back to the Shire after completing and basically failing right at the end, um, he wants to go back to live his normal life and be the person he was before. But he says, how do you pick up the threads of an old life when in your heart you begin to understand there is no going back? So he has sacrificed himself for this cause, which he never wanted to do in the first place, which is incredibly brave. And it's like, I think even now in the world we live in today, it's like, yeah, I just want to go back to 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago when Lord of the Rings came out. It was felt like it was a much better time, but you can't go back. Like, you're in this now, and you have to make the most of it. You can't wallow in self pity. You can't say, I'm not doing it. The time has decided that this is where you are, and this is what you have to do. And like Frodo, we have to push through. There is no going back. Sam as well. I wouldn't say he's really a reluctant hero because he's keen to go with Frodo every step of the way, but there is that moment in Fellowship of the Ring where he says, "If I take another step, this will be the furthest I've ever been away from home," and then Frodo is able to get him moving. But once he does that, he's pretty much all in. Frodo does turn him away at one point, but he fights back because he knows that he needs to be there for Frodo, and that's another good lesson. Sometimes your friends will turn against you if they've been influenced by a bad influence, and they will send you away. But a true friend knows when to come back and help them out. Now, Merry and Pippin, interesting as well. They are sort of the comic relief of the first film, and I will say that I think some of the comedy is the worst parts of the films. Like, I think when there's sincerity, the films are extremely strong, and when they're relying on jokes, it's pretty average. But so Merry and Pippin, it is interesting to see their journey from being that comic relief to, convincing the tree people that no, you have to get involved in this, and showing them that this will impact them as well. And I think that's another lesson we can take, as some of us like to be bystanders, that sometimes when there's a fight, you do have to get involved because you may not see how it impacts you initially, but down the track, you may be withholding yourself from a war that you could be helping fight for the side that you want. And Mary sort of learns this, and I think even in Return of the King, when he wants to fight and Theoden says that he can't. He's not going to be able to help. There's a good lesson where Eowyn says, he has every right to fight, to go to war for the ones he loves as well. And I think this is a great message about how anyone can do anything, but it's not that, oh well, he's a hobbit, so he should just be given everything. It's, he's a hobbit, but he has the fire to fight, so he should be given that opportunity to fight for survival. Um, and I think that's great. It's not, these movies are very aggressive. It's not about all like living in harmony. It's about, they're just under so much pressure all the time, and it's like they need to fight for everything. And I think Mary embraces that fight. Pippin, it takes a bit longer. He does mess up with that ball of Saruman, and then Gandalf, who's just dominating every film, has to then make a plan to get him to Gondor and shake things up. But even Pippin, I think, when he gets separated from Mary, like that's the point where he gets it. Like, okay, like, the world isn't always going to be as you want it. Like, bad things will happen and take you away from the ones that you love, and then you do have to fight. And then he does that. He defends Gandalf, and the it takes him a bit longer, but the reality of the situation sets in on him as well, and he becomes a hero as well by the end of Return of the King. Now, I'll just speak about Gandalf because, yeah, he 3 votes Gandalf. He's just all over these movies, but some of his great quotes, which it feels like Tolkien just speaking straight to the audience. So Frodo's saying, "I don't really want to be a hero," and Gandalf replies, "So do we all who see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." So, yeah, it's like I don't want to have to live in these hard times. I want the good times. But Gandalf says, you don't get to choose that. You just get to make the most of what you've got in the situation. So, Frodo, get on your bike. You got to take the ring to Mordor. Um, but I think that really is the crux of the story. It's like everyone wants to live in the good times, but when evil comes to your door and threatens you, you do have to fight back, because life has to be fought for. You can't. It's not just given. And I think that's one of the big lessons from these movies. Some more Gandalf quotes. He says, Saruman believes that it is only great power that can keep evil in check, but that is not what I have found. It is the small everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay, small acts of kindness and love. And then, it is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succour of the years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after me have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule. So I like these 2 quotes as well, because it's Gandalf's basically saying, look, you don't have to do it all. You don't have to be a magician, even though he is, but he's leading everyone else and saying, you just have to do your bit. Everyday acts of kindness and love, that is what keeps evil away. And I think it's a great lesson. We need to do our bit in small moments, make good micro decisions, um, show people the way, spread love and kindness, and that is how the world remains a good place. If we succumb to these evils ourselves and we choose to spread them, like Saruman does, then we're part of the problem. But if we can just do the little things right, the world will be a better place for everyone. Um, and anyway, moving on, something about leadership. So I think a big theme of this is how leadership can decay in the good times. So Theoden and Denethor, like, they have been kings for a long period of time when things have been good, and then things turn bad, and they don't know how to deal with it. Theoden, he succumbs to the mind virus of Saruman, which is very interesting because it feels like that's very relevant today with all of the mind control and social media, and it feels like there's a war for people's minds to believe different things. And Theoden is someone who succumbed to that in the Two Towers, but Gandalf doesn't give up on him, and he removes the mind virus or Saruman from his mind, and he gets Theoden back. And I think that ties in with other parts of the story, which is even Aragorn going to the army of the dead and saying, "I'll forgive you of your sins if you fight with us now." You know, you can always atone for your sins, and you should give people the opportunity to come back if they have gone off the wrong path. And um, Theoden is able to do that. And it's funny, like I haven't seen these films for a long time, and Theoden's not a character that I would have remembered at all. Legolas is a character that seems to be one of the most famous from the films, and honestly, he's pretty useless. Like he doesn't do anything apart from just fight like a PlayStation character, and has really bad dialogue. But Theoden, a character that I can't even remember, was like one of my favorites from watching the series. And then we have Denethor, who's like the king of Gondor. I don't know if he's the king, but he's like running the show. Um, and he falls into a depression because his son Boromir dies, and he has Faramir still there, still has the opportunity, but he prematurely thinks that he's died as well, and he even tells him before that he would rather that he died instead of Boromir. Um, yeah, he's basically just a bit of a doomer, and ends up lighting himself on fire and jumping off the top of the castle of Gondor. Um, and I think it just shows that he's had these good times as king, and when he has any sort of conflict, he's unable to deal with it. So if you are a leader, you need to be able to stay sharp and stay on top of your game, or otherwise leaders need to change because a weak leader will bring the bad times back. And that brings me to Aragorn, and look, he's basically a bit of a badass for all of the films, and he earns his place as the king. Like he's on the front lines fighting, risking his life, and when he becomes king, all the people are cheering. It's like, yes, they owe like their lives to this man. Like he has earned his place as king. Um, he is a king of hard times. He's saved, one of many, but he saved the world basically, or their kingdom. So it's it almost shows like what type of king you are. It depends on when you came into power, and if you've been in power for a while with no struggles, then all of a sudden you could have a struggle and not be able to deal with it. But Aragorn, it's like, I think now in life we come to resent people in power, but watching this movie, I was like, wow, like if they get there by earning it, by risking it all, by putting their life on the line to save others, like they deserve to be where they are, and that's definitely Aragorn by the end. But anyway, thank you for listening. Yeah, it's interesting. I think going back and watching old films like this, because maybe what you had in your mind of what the film was about, especially if it was a film that you watched as a child, you might actually get a completely different lesson when you watch it as an adult, like 15, 20 years later. Um, and I think Lord of the Rings, while I wouldn't say they were my favorite films I've ever seen, there's certainly a lot of cheesy moments I didn't really love. But I think when the movie was showing sincerity and those interactions between people and the examples of the good and the bad, that's when it's at its absolute strongest. And yeah, I'd give it a recommend for anyone who hadn't seen it for a while, who's interested in going back and having another watch. But thanks for listening.